December 17th, 2010. A Tunisian street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi sets himself on fire to protest government corruption. His desperate act ignites a firestorm. Protests erupt, toppling Tunisia's dictator. The movement spreads like wildfire across the Middle East. Egypt's Mubarak falls. Libya's Gaddafi is killed. Syria descends into civil war. The world called it the Arab Spring, a beautiful, spontaneous bloom of democracy. Social media was hailed as the great liberator. Young protesters were our new heroes. But look closer, a strange pattern emerges. Every country that erupted in chaos had something in common. Yes, they were authoritarian, but they were also oil-rich nations that had recently started to challenge Western energy interests. They were moving away from the US dollar. Libya had Africa's largest oil reserves and was planning a gold-backed currency. Syria was building pipelines that bypassed Western control. Egypt controlled the Suez Canal, a vital artery for 10% of the world's oil. Meanwhile, the Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, far more authoritarian, saw almost no unrest. Why? Because they stayed loyal. They kept pricing their oil in dollars. This wasn't a spontaneous revolution. This was an energy war, cleverly disguised as a human rights crusade. And understanding this reveals how modern empires are built, not with armies, but with manufactured chaos. To understand why certain countries were targeted, you have to look at what their leaders were planning. Before the protests began, each one was making a move towards energy independence, a move that threatened the petrodollar system. Muammar Gaddafi in Libya had the most audacious plan, a gold-backed African dinar. He'd stockpiled 144 tons of gold to create a new currency for African nations to trade oil, completely cutting out the US dollar. This would have freed African producers from Western financial control. For a country with Africa's biggest oil reserves, this was an existential threat to Western dominance. Syria, meanwhile, was constructing pipelines to bring Iranian and Russian gas to Europe, sidestepping Western energy giants. This would have given Russia and Iran a direct line to European markets, weakening Western influence. And in Egypt, Hosni Mubarak was strengthening ties with Russia and China, moving away from reliance on Western investment. His control over the Suez Canal made his growing independence a major strategic problem. The Arab Spring was sold to us as the first social media revolution. Facebook and Twitter, we were told, empowered ordinary people. But the reality was far more sinister. It was psychological warfare. Years before the first tweet was sent from Tahrir Square, Western intelligence agencies were already studying how to use social media to manipulate political movements. DARPA, the Pentagon's research arm, was funding projects on computational propaganda, using algorithms to shape public opinion. During the Arab Spring, this tech was unleashed. Sophisticated social media campaigns amplified some messages and buried others. Hashtags went viral not by chance, but by design, creating the illusion of a massive, unified uprising. The tech companies weren't neutral platforms. They actively collaborated with governments. Twitter's own algorithms were tweaked to boost anti-government content. Behind the screens and the hashtags was a ground game powered by a vast network of non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. These groups, funded by Western governments and foundations like the National Endowment for Democracy and Open Society foundations, had been operating in these countries for years. They weren't just digging wells and teaching English. They were building the infrastructure for regime change. They trained activists in how to organize protests, how to get international media attention, and how to frame their demands in a way that would win Western sympathy. This support system meant that the opposition could outlast any government crackdown. When peaceful protests weren't enough, the playbook shifted to humanitarian intervention. We saw it in Yugoslavia, we saw it in Iraq, and we saw it perfected in Libya. The pattern is always the same. First, you document human rights abuses, often amplifying unverified claims. You generate international outrage. Then you justify military intervention to protect civilians. In Libya, early protest violence was blasted across global media, while the government's response was painted as genocide. NATO's bombing campaign wasn't about protecting civilians. It was about regime change. They specifically targeted oil facilities to ensure that a post-Gaddafi Libya couldn't control its own energy destiny. They tried the same thing in Syria, but Russian intervention prevented a full-scale takeover. Instead, Syria was plunged into a proxy war designed to destroy its energy infrastructure and stop those pipelines from ever being built. So what happened after the dust settled? The true purpose was laid bare. In every country where a government fell, Western corporations swooped in. Within months of Gaddafi's death, Libya's oil fields were carved up among Western energy giants. The gold he had saved for the African dinar vanished into Western banks. The new government immediately went back to selling oil for dollars. In Egypt, energy deals with Russia and China were scrapped. The goal was never democracy, it was dependency. Where regime change failed, the goal became permanent chaos. Syria's endless war ensures its oil and gas can't compete on the world market. Yemen's collapse secures Saudi dominance in the region. The instability keeps these nations weak, their resources untapped or available on someone else's terms. But the most telling part of this story is who was left untouched. The Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar. These are some of the most restrictive regimes on earth, yet they remained stable. Why? They play by the rules. They sell their oil in dollars. They are loyal allies. When small protests did pop up in Bahrain, Saudi tanks rolled in to crush them with the full, quiet support of the West. The same organizations that screamed about human rights abuses in Libya were silent. This reveals the hypocrisy at the heart of the whole affair. The ultimate target was, and still is, Iran. Iran has massive energy reserves and has consistently defied Western control, selling oil and other currencies, and building its own alliances. The Arab Spring was designed to surround and isolate Iran, to destabilize its allies like Syria, and to secure strategic choke points. This was also about keeping Europe in line. European deals with Russia and Libya threatened to create an energy system outside of Anglo-American control. The Arab Spring shattered those relationships, destroying pipelines and suppliers, and forcing Europe back into dependency on Western-controlled energy. And let's not forget the financial warfare. Libya's plan for an African currency, Syria's non-dollar trade, Egypt's pivot to China, all were direct threats to the dollar's global dominance. The chaos of the Arab Spring crushed these alternatives. And finally, the millions of refugees fleeing these wars served a purpose too. They destabilized Europe, fueled right-wing movements, and created a perpetual crisis that justified more military spending and intervention. If you see the Arab Spring not as a democratic dream but as orchestrated energy warfare, today's global conflicts suddenly make a lot more sense. The same playbook, social media manipulation, NGO networks, humanitarian narratives, is being used elsewhere. And look at the patterns. It's a modern form of empire, and one that rules not through occupation but through chaos. The human cost has been astronomical. Millions dead, tens of millions displaced, entire nations in ruins. But from a cold, geopolitical perspective, the mission was a success. Challenges to Western energy control were neutralized. The dollar remained king. The Arab Spring bloomed, then quickly withered into an endless winter. And perhaps that was the plan all along. Thanks for watching.